Hi everyone, and welcome back to Octopus Builds, where we are building out the Trident Project for the fictional company Octopet Shop. My name is Bob Walker, and I'm a technical director over here at Octopus Deploy. And today I want to continue our discussion around blue-green style deployments. Specifically, let's talk a little bit about canary-style deployments for using blue-green. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things I've done off camera just to make things a little bit clearer when you're looking at it. The first thing you're going to notice is that I have gotten rid of the release legacy channel. Now everything is using blue-green style deployments when they're on the release branch. I've also updated these two tenants to deploy to both staging blue-green as well as production blue-green. And the big reason I did that, just to make things a little bit clearer for everybody. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on and one of the flaws with what we have set up right now. So let's take a first look at our process, and it will make a little bit more sense what I'm about to say. So right now, with step number 9, what this is doing is it's basically saying, okay, redirect all of the traffic from the previous version, let's say blue, onto green, or from green onto blue. If we were to look at this from a diagram point of view, what's going on is during the deployment, everyone is still continued to deploy to the V1 of the application, the previous version of the application, while Octopus Deploy is in the process of updating and deploying the next version. Now, once that's done, Octopus Deploy finishes and the load balancer is updated to point to the second version of the application. Now, for a good chunk of the time, that should be perfectly fine. However, for a number of applications that might be out there, that might not be acceptable, especially because you're basically redirecting 100% of the traffic over to the next version of the application, which is just hoping that everything is going to work perfectly fine. And this is where canary-style deployments comes into play. So with canary-style deployments, what's going to happen is instead of redirecting 100% of the traffic over, 90% of the traffic will still stay pointed to the previous version of the application, while we can do things like 10% of the traffic gets redirected to the other version of the application. If anything were to go wrong, well, then we could then just update this traffic to point back to the V1. So that 10% will go back to the previous version of the application. Assuming things go right, which they should, we could then increase the amount of traffic from 10 to 20 to 30 to 50 to 100%. Really up to you and how you want to do that. Now, the nice thing about this is that you have the capability then to monitor changes, monitor for bugs. If you start noticing bugs right away, you go, oh my gosh, okay, redirect that 10% back to the previous version of the application right now. However, if you get out to 50%, you start noticing some problems, then you can slowly start peeling people back to the previous version of the code. Now, for every application that's out there, doing something like this requires a higher degree of discipline than I would say even blue-green style deployments, because with blue-green style deployments, it's basically, okay, everyone was pointed to the old version, now you're all pointed to the new version. You get the new version of the UI, you get the new version of the back-end system, happy days. Whereas this, you are potentially running two versions of the application at the same time. And so depending on the application, this could be very, very tricky, because think about just from a simple UI point of view. If I were to add an additional field onto a page, how would that react? Do I have 100% of the UI code being redirected to the new version of the application, while 10% of the API code is only redirected to the new version of the application? So there's a lot of discussions that you're going to have internally whether or not it makes sense for your application to do this. That being said, I do want to talk through and show you how to do something like this within Octopus Deploy, because I think it makes a lot of sense. So let's jump back over here. Now, I've seen canary-style deployments done a few ways within Octopus Deploy, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit as to what I think would be the best approach, especially when dealing with, say, multi-tenancy, dealing with load balancers and everything along those lines. So one of the approaches that I've seen is to have a canary style deployment managed by your different environments. Now, so let's group by our channels again. So instead of staging blue, staging green, production blue, production green, you'd have staging 10, staging 20, staging 30, staging 70, staging 100, whatever the case may be. And then each environment you have different, you might have different variables indicating the percentage of the load balancer to move towards, or you have different machines that you want to deploy to. It's really up to you in terms of how you want to leverage those environments. Now, the reason I'm not a super big fan of something like that is that you don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of the percentage of traffic. It's basically, I'm moving over these servers, and now these servers are going to be hosting the new version of the application. In addition to that, if we wanted to just do percentages, so let's come back over here. So we have, inside of here, we just want to mess around with percentages. So we want to deploy to all of the various servers that we have, and we just want to mess around with percentages on this step. Then we'd have to skip through all of these steps, step 1 through 8 to get to that point. Again, I'm not a super big fan of something like that, but I like the idea of having the flexibility of percents. So what I'd want to do is I want to create a runbook that handles the redirection of traffic based on some sort of indicator. And to do that, there's a couple things we're going to have to do. The first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add in a new project template variable. And yeah, it makes sense here. So I'm just going to call this project.loadbalancer.hostname, and this will make sense in just a second. But I'm just going to call this the project.tenant.loadbalancer hostname. Actually, you know what? Yes, I do want to do this at per environment level. So I'm just going to do host name and call it host name for the Trident project. And I want this to be a single line text box, and I do not, and you know what, actually I do want to have a value. So I'm just going to call this octopus.environment, my good lord, environment.name. And then I am going to come in here and I'm going to, I want to say tenant.retail.short name. I think is what I call it. I'm going to double check that really quick before I forget. So I'm going to save this. And let's go over to our library really quick. Because what I want to do is I want to use, and this is going to be fairly common, that what we're going to see is that a number of users, short name, tenant.short name. I was slightly off. It's a good idea to do something like this where you have naming conventions. That way you don't have to update every single tenant under the sun, because the second that I click save, if I didn't have a default value, what I would have to do is then come into my tenants, come into my variables, and then for every single variable that we have floating around out here, we would have to come in here and we would have to add a value for this. And that could get pretty old pretty fast. So I like having, and I always recommend people leverage naming conventions whenever possible, and then overwrite those naming conventions based on what they're trying to do. Okay, so we got that ready to go. So the reason why I wanted to do that is because we're going to be adding in some prompted variables for this runbook. But before we do that, let's go ahead and create this runbook. So I'm going to go ahead and add a runbook, and I'm just going to call this update canary load balancer. I want to save that because I forgot to save that in a previous recording. This is actually the second recording I've done of this. The first one was a bit of a disaster, and my recommendation ended up not working at all. So not a happy day for me. Alrighty, so the first thing that we want to do is let's go ahead and let's add in a step. And so what this step is going to do, this is going to be the brains of the whole operation. And this is going to be the bit that actually changes the load balancer. So I'm going to say update load balancer. I want to run you on a worker. I'm going to add in my notes because I do like having notes. One of the advantages of doing kind of a sandbox run, I guess, is that I have everything all ready to go, hopefully. The next thing I want to do is I am going to paste in this script. And this script is kind of doing a lot, so I want to walk you through what it's doing. The first thing it's going to do is it's basically saying I want to route a bit of traffic over to a new version of the code. Now, within that, I also adding in some verification. Let's say after I do this, I'm going to verify. Maybe I have a separate step that does the verification, but for the purposes of this example, we really don't need to get super fancy with this. But basically, updating the load balancer, sudo updating the load balancer. Then we want to verify it, make sure everything's looking good. So maybe we wait around for 3, 4, 5 minutes, verify that there's no errors. And that makes a lot of sense. That would be something that you'd want to do before you would proceed on to the next bit. And then we would take whatever percentage of traffic that we got in as a value, so that's a variable, and we'd want to increase that to, basically double that. But for the purposes of this right now, so I'm going to start out with 10. I'm going to have a delay of 1 minute, and that's going to say testing host. And the big reason why I want to do this is because I want to show you what this will look like in the future. So let's go ahead and click on done. All right, so we have the load balancer step. So I'm going to go ahead and add another step, and this is the kind of the key to the whole bit, which is I'm going to run a runbook that will basically, I'm going to rerun this exact same runbook. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the percentage update that I got from the first step. So the first step, it gets a load balancer, says update 10% of the traffic. And then it says, assuming everything looks good, after a minute, update that traffic to 20%. And we don't want to have 55 steps inside of my runbook that does all of this. So I just want to rerun the exact same runbook. So I'm going to say rerun runbook to update load balancer. So I'm going to run this also on a worker. Update canary load balancer. Base URL, API key, which I already have. It's the advantage of slowly building everything out is I have all of this stuff already defined. Project name will be Trident. And here's kind of the kicker is that the tenant name I'm not going to specify. I'm actually going to be passing in the host name that I want to update as opposed to passing in the different tenants. And I was thinking about this for a little bit and I go, there's not really anything specific tenant-wise that I need to worry about except for the actual host name, but I can pass that in as a prompted variable. So instead of having this like zillions of tenants flying around, I can make this a little bit simpler. In addition, we're running into a weird quirk right now with prompted variables and tenants and runbooks not behaving correctly, so it's kind of a quirk. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wait for finish. And what this is saying is that I want to wait until this is done. Sorry, I do not want to wait until this is done. I'm basically going to fire and forget this. I have my prompted variables. So let's go ahead and populate these. Actually, I don't have any prompted variables yet. I will have prompted variables in just a quick second. But I do have the runbook runtime all specified. So what this is, instead of triggering the runbook to run right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to run, and I'm going to say I want you to run at some point in the near future. And so that's what that other step is doing for me. And I only want to run this for, the runbook is going to handle that for me. I do have a variable run condition, and so let's go ahead and populate that. And what I'm doing here is that if this verification step fails, this update load balancer and verify fails, that I want to rerun the runbook. I do not want to run this runbook. I want to stop the deployment. I want to skip out of it. I want to do whatever the case may be, but do everything but run this runbook. Or conversely, if I've hit a certain percentage, let's say I've hit 100% of all the traffic's been redirected, I don't want to rerun this. So let's go ahead and let's just not mess around with that. So unless, just make sure I have all the good stuff because I have been known to mess this up. Wait for it. Okay. Now you might notice that I picked a different step. Like I said, I was running into a quirk inside of here. This is actually, I have to make an update to the run a runbook step. By the time you see this recording, that should already be pushed up there, but just wanted to get it out there. All right. And I can add in a step to notify, but I'm going to do that in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and publish it because I do need that to work. So I publish this. And the big reason behind that is because, again, I'm going to be calling the runbook from this runbook. So I'm going to go ahead and trigger this in staging blue. Haha. Now here's the thing I need to change. Is I do not want to leverage multi-tenancy in this particular runbook. And you can do that by coming into the runbook, going into settings, multi-tenancy, and I say cannot be run against a runbook. While I am here, I am going to just keep the 30 latest runs instead of 100. There's no reason for me to keep all of those. That's mostly just me being me. I can't help myself but make things a little bit more efficient. I do want to go to staging blue, run the published one. There's no changes. So what this is going to do is it's going to update the load balancer and sudo update the load balancer. I don't have an actual load balancer I'm updating. But in your case, you'd have a script. So I'm going to say I want to point 10% of the traffic for testing hosts to staging blue servers. Then I'm going to trigger the runbook to up the load balancer to 20% in 1 minute. And so that's what this step is doing, is it's triggering that runbook, and I got a failure. That's fine. Well, server returned a bad request invoking. Yeah, I think I need to finish running all my other stuff on top of this, but it is doing what I expected it to do, which is good. Okay. So I have that. So the next step that I want to do is I have my runbook ready to go. Now I need to come in here and I need to make some changes to my deployment process, because I want to call this runbook rather than calling this step, this update load balancer to blue or green. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and create a branch. From main. All right, so I'm going to come in here and I am going to update this load balancer from blue to green. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this step because I do not need it anymore. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a step that calls that runbook. So call my copy. Again, you will not have to worry about this. This should all work just fine for you. So I just need to call the canary deployment runbook. Run once on a worker, hosted Windows, runbook name. This is why I copied it in there, because I have forgotten that in the past, and I was like, oh my gosh. API key. Optional. Oops, Trident. Let's try that again. There we go. I'm not going to pass in the tenant name. I want to use the publish snapshot. I do not want to finish. Wait for the finish because I basically want to fire and forget this. I then want to populate. I'm going to add in some prompted variables very shortly. So let's go ahead and let's just preemptively add in those prompted variables. So what this is my a super simple format. So basically it's the prompted variable name, colon, colon, and then the value we want to populate. All right, so we're going to come in here, and then finally we're going to do the scheduling. Actually, no, we're going to schedule this to fire right away, so that way we don't have to wait for it. Machine list, everything is looking good. And I want to run for only specific environments. Actually, I only want to run this for specific channels, which is my release channel, because that's the one that has blue-green style deployments. Success, yep, everything is looking good. So let's go ahead and reorder this, because we want this to run after we verify. Awesome. So I'm going to say swapping out the update load balance. Oh my gosh. Book. Okay, so we got that. And then I'm going to add in a prompted variable. Actually, 3 prompted variables. I have project load balancer %. So this is the %, and by default, I want it to be 10. And so I'm going to open up the editor, and this is what a prompted variable looks like. If you recall from the ServiceNow, it's going to be very familiar. Ser %. Make this a single line text box, and I want to define the scope. And this is only going to be for staging blue, staging green, production blue, production green, and this is also where I want to specify the process. Add to list. Next one. Wait in minutes. And for this, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm actually going to default this to 1 minute. My earlier recording, I was doing 10 minutes, and I was just wasting everyone's time. Open editor. I wasn't having them wait for 10 minutes. Update delay. Delay in minutes. I wasn't having them wait for 10. I wasn't having to wait for 10 minutes. I was stopping the recording, but at the same time, no one wants to sit there and just wait for this to finish up. We want to get it triggered relatively quickly. If I was a smart man, I wouldn't have done minutes. I would have done seconds, but I think minutes is a healthy compromise, because you got to think about this in the real world. You know, you're not going to put in 60,000 seconds, so you're not going to have some sort of conversion process. It's hard enough to convert minutes to hours. When you start talking about 6.57 hour, you get into this kind of crazy stuff. So we don't want to deal with that. Add to list, and then finally, project.loadbalancer.host to update. And I want to change this type. I want this to be. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do project templates. Grab the name of the variable, because that's what I want to pass in. Host name, and I'm going to, let's add in, make sure I got the Octo stash appropriately. So I want to open up the editor. I also want to prompt for value on this one. But the difference for this is I am only going to prompt for this when I run the actual runbook, not for the other ones, because that's going to be specified by the tenant that I decide to deploy to. So awesome. So add this to the list. Adding in prompted variables. Great. So the only downside of this is that I do have to merge my changes into the main branch to take advantage of those prompted variables. But what we can do is I'm going to go ahead and just create a release really quickly, and I'm just going to make sure that everything is wired up. If it fails on the call, I assume that that's going to be okay, because it's just, it's like, oh, I don't have the prompted variables or whatever the case may be. So let's go ahead and let's do the release, and then I will trigger the deployment. To staging blue. Pick my tenant. So this is the reason why I wanted to have prompted variables for both the deployment process as well as the runbook run, because you might have a situation where you're deploying a feature and you're like, you know what, who cares, 50%, let's YOLO it, or 100%, or it's a really big feature that's going to be extremely complex and you're not quite sure how well it's going to work, and you're like, I don't really want to wait. I want to say 3%. I do want to wait, and then I want to do this every 10 hours, basically increase it every 10 hours, because it's it's a fairly substantial release. We want to make sure that everything's working. Again, it's completely up to you as to why you want to do something like this. But for this, I'm just going to pop in and just say 10 and 1. All right. So I will be back once this reaches the point where it is calling that runbook. So hopefully everything goes correctly. All right, so we are back with just about ready to call that runbook. So unlike before where we just swapped over the load balancer, now we're going to call out a runbook from our deployment process to update it to hopefully be 10%. So it has automatically invoked that runbook for us. And so we should be able to see it get kicked off here. And now it's going to rerun this. And we should be good for something like this. So the fact that it worked means I can merge all of my changes into my main branch. I still don't know why this part is failing. I guess it's just being a jerk. I have a few things I'll need to tweak on something like this, but let's go ahead and let's start the whole merge process. So I'm just going to come over here to github.com/. All right, come over to Trident, create my pull request. Added in some variables, added in my deployment process, so it's going to go ahead and merge those. And I'm going to leave that branch around. Last time I didn't, and came back and bit me. So go back to my process screen because I want to change over to my main branch. So I should see, yep, run the runbook. In my project, I should see the new prompted variables, which I do. Fantastic. Okay, so now let's update the runbook to leverage those prompted variables. So let's go ahead and get this all squared away. I want to update these to be the actual leverage the actual variables because it can get a little dicey if I forget to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Next thing I want to do is let's revisit what I'm doing here. Update canary load balancer. Project name's Trident. Tenants, use publish snapshot, wait for finish, use guide failure. I did call that update load balancer, right? Okay. Now let's provide the prompted variables. So what I'm doing here, as opposed to just leveraging whatever prompted variable got sent in, I am using the value that came in from the update load balancer and the percent of traffic. So this should be the new percent of traffic. But then I just send in whatever the wait in minutes is that I got from before, and then whatever the host name was that I got before. So let's go ahead and we should be good to go. Octopus action, update load balancer. Yep. Should be good. Update load balance. Yep. And now I'm going to go ahead and save this. Going to republish it because now I have new variables. I've updated my snapshot. Excuse me. I've updated my process. So fingers crossed that everything runs. If this doesn't run, I'm going to have to pause one more time and figure out what's going on here. And I'm just going to give it a host name. I'm just going to call this testing host. Cool. And go ahead and hit run. So we should see this. Go ahead and run this. Now, back to that verification piece of this. So this does do a pseudo verification. By pseudo, I mean what it does is it will basically generate a random number and say, hey, is this below 95? If it is, happy days. We'll continue processing as we expect it to process. I wonder why this keeps happening. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to figure out what's going on here. I will be back in just a quick second as to why it's not working. All right, so I figured out what was going on. So if you recall, I set the prompted variable value to 1 minute. What ended up happening here was that that was actually a little bit too soon because what was happening was the dynamic worker and the Octopus server. I think there was a slight delay between the two. They're not 100% synced up, at least like not to that level. And I've seen this happen a few times. So basically, what was happening was my step was telling the Octopus deploy server to trigger a runbook to happen in the future, but in fact, it was happening in the past. So it happens. So if in the future, if I were to do this in a real world scenario, if I wanted to set something to wait, I'd probably do it like at a 30-minute or a 60-minute interval. You're not going to run into something like that. But because I had it set to testing and I was set to 1, that's when I was running into that. So you can set that to 5 and happy days. It should solve your problem. So not a big deal. I just thought that was a little funny that was happening. I had been scratching my head for a good 3, 4, 5 minutes trying to figure out what was going on something like that. So one other thing I want to do before I leave for today is I want to make sure that I have my, I'm going to clone this step in. That way I have the, everything is consistent, I guess is what I'm getting back to. Process, and then I'm going to go ahead and notify when this creation step fails. So I'm just going to say notify when the update load balancer fails. All right, so go ahead and save this, publish this. Okay, so what have we done today? Let's take a brief stock. We have created a runbook that will update the canary load balancer. Excuse me, update the load balancer in a canary fashion. So this script that has been provided, it accepts a percentage of traffic, the host to update, and the delay in minutes. And then from here, it will update that percentage of traffic, tell the load balancer to do that in on step 14. In the real world, you'd be communicating to, like, say, an F5 or something along those lines. Then it will go ahead and it will increase that. I did a simple just doubling of something along those lines. And then it will take that information, rerun the existing runbook that I already have, and basically tell it to keep on increasing until it reaches to 100. Within here, we could have additional steps where we could do additional verification before we trigger the runbook. It is completely up to you as to what you want to do and what you don't want to do. But at the end of the day, I think this is a better overall solution because you are controlling how are you increasing your canary percentages without having to go in and constantly update your deployment process. To me, the verification bits and the updating the canary, that kind of feels like it's a little outside of the deployment process. So I think a runbook run makes a lot of sense in this particular case. The other thing that we did is we swapped out the deployment process, we swapped out a step in the deployment process, step number 9. It no longer runs as a, where it just says, hey, I want you to update the load balancer to point to the new version of the code. It now does it via a canary-style deployment. After this, I'm going to update the notes just to kind of keep things a little bit consistent. So yeah, before I do leave, you might be having this kind of final question in your mind. That's group by channel. Do you need to have blue-green deployments to do canary-style deployments? And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. You don't need something like that. If you're doing something like with AWS Lambda, a lot of that stuff is built in. You don't need to have 2 separate environments. If you're doing something with, say, Kubernetes, same thing. A lot of that functionality is built in, especially with ingress controllers. You might have multiple environments in a situation like a staging 1 or a staging 2, and then a production 1, production 2, or production active, production staging, production beta, whatever you want to call it. If you have some sort of, if you're deploying to, say, virtual machines, or you're deploying where you have some sort of convention, or you're spinning up entirely new infrastructure as to what you want to do. But I guess the point is you do not need to have blue-green style deployments in order to take advantage of Canary. I'm only doing that just to kind of keep things consistent, but in the real world, it is completely up to you as to how you want to do it. The approach that I would definitely recommend, no matter which approach you take, is to leverage a runbook to increase the load balancer and to run those steps. As we can see here, it has finally picked up and triggered because I triggered this 5 minutes ago. And so it should go ahead and start running this automatically for me once the lease has been acquired. And then we should see it update, because I think I sent it through at 10%, so we should see 20% and then 5 minutes as well for this. But yes, so this is kind of a good way. Yep, so we can see updated to 20%, and then it's going to be triggering the runbook to update the load balancer to 40% in 5 minutes. So this is a way that I would definitely recommend going forward in the future as to what you should be doing for updating your load balancer. I think this is a really good use case for your runbooks. But again, it is completely up to you as how you want to do it. You can include this as part of your deployment process, and you could use multiple environments. I like this just because it's a little bit cleaner. So thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.